The store was alive with chaos, voices clashing, carts rattling, and an unmistakable tension thickening the air. Isaac stood by the entrance, his presence understated but oddly magnetic. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly, their cold glow casting sharp shadows on the polished floor. He adjusted his worn cap, pulling it lower as if to hide, but his eyes, their sharpness and depth, hinted he was not just another shopper. The argument erupted suddenly, loud enough to stop the faint hum of casual conversation. "Are you deaf?" I said, "Get out of my way." The voice, sharp and dripping with authority, belonged to Sylvia, the store manager. Her manicured hand rested on her hip, her expression a cocktail of irritation and disdain. She towered over a young cashier who was fumbling nervously with a plastic bag. "I am sorry, ma'am," the cashier stammered, his voice barely audible. "Sorry doesn't fix incompetence," Sylvia snapped, her tone cutting deeper than her words. "This is a store, not a daycare. If you can't handle customers, maybe this job isn't for you." Isaac watched from a few feet away, his expression unreadable, a silent observer. "Excuse me, can I just—" A woman in line began to interject, but Sylvia spun around, her voice rising. "You'll wait your turn," she barked. "This is my store, and I won't have anyone disrupting my process." Isaac's brow furrowed slightly, but he stayed where he was, leaning lightly on his cane. He didn't speak, not yet. The cashier's hands shook as he handed the woman her change. His face was pale, eyes darting nervously towards Sylvia, as if begging for the ground to swallow him whole. Sylvia, however, wasn't done. "Next time, pay attention," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. She turned back toward her office, heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. But she wasn't watching where she was going. Her shoulder bumped Isaac as she passed, and she stopped, spinning on her heel to face him. "Do you mind?" she hissed. "If you're just here to loiter, I suggest you leave. This isn't a charity." Isaac's eyes met hers for the first time. Calm, collected, unshaken. "Just here to look around," he replied, his voice low and even. Sylvia narrowed her eyes. "Well, try not to get in the way." She strode off, her commanding presence leaving a ripple of tension in her wake. Isaac remained where he was, his hand tightening slightly on the handle of his cane. For a moment, the store seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. But then, near the checkout counter, another commotion erupted. "Excuse me," a man's voice boomed. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Isaac turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on the source of the disturbance. A tall man in an expensive suit stood glaring at the young cashier from earlier. The boy's face flushed red as he fumbled with the credit card reader. "I am sorry, sir. It's just—" "Save it," the man interrupted. "You've wasted enough of my time already. Where's your manager?" Sylvia reappeared almost instantly, as if summoned by the man's frustration. She plastered on a smile, though it barely concealed her irritation. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet. "Your employee is the problem," the man snapped. "He doesn't seem to know how to do his job." Sylvia turned her icy gaze to the cashier, who shrank under its weight. "I'll handle this," she said coldly. Isaac shifted slightly, his fingers drumming lightly against his cane. He wasn't looking at the argument anymore. He was looking at the store itself. The high shelves, the buzzing checkout lanes, the polished floors. It was as if he was seeing it all for the first time. The voices grew louder, but Isaac tuned them out. His focus remained sharp, his eyes scanning every corner, every detail. Something was stirring in him, a quiet but undeniable energy. "Hey, old man." The voice jolted him back to the moment. Sylvia stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her lips curled into a smirk. "Are you just going to stand there all day, or do you actually plan to shop?" Isaac met her gaze, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Just taking it all in," he said quietly. Sylvia laughed, the sound dripping with mockery. Well, don't take too long. We don't need loiterers scaring off paying customers. Isaac didn't respond. He turned and walked toward the back of the store, his steps deliberate, almost reverent. The tension in the air thickened as customers whispered among themselves. Who was this man? Why hadn't he spoken up or fought back? In the distance, Sylvia continued berating the cashier, her voice a harsh counterpoint to the soft murmur of shoppers. Isaac disappeared around a corner, his figure fading into the aisles. But his presence lingered. By the time Isaac returned to the front of the store, the atmosphere had shifted. Sylvia was now arguing with another employee, her voice rising with every sentence. Isaac stood silently, watching, waiting. The cashier from earlier caught his eye and offered a small, apologetic smile. Isaac nodded in return, his gaze steady and kind. Sylvia turned abruptly, her eyes locking onto Isaac. You again, she sneered. Do you actually have something to buy, or are you just here to waste my time? Isaac stepped forward, his movements deliberate. I've seen enough, he said, his voice calm but firm. Sylvia laughed again, though it sounded strained. Seen enough of what? You're just another customer. You don't matter here. Isaac tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. We'll see about that, he said softly. And with that, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Sylvia and the rest of the store in a stunned silence. Whatever was coming next, it was clear. Isaac was not just another customer. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers and fresh bread from the corner bakery. Isaac stood by his small delivery truck, the paint chipped in places, but still gleaming under his careful upkeep. His uniform, neatly pressed, hung loosely on his slim frame. He adjusted his cap and wiped his hands on a rag, taking a moment to scan the quiet neighborhood. Morning, Mr. Isaac, a young boy called out, waving as he raced past on a rusty bike. Isaac tipped his cap in reply, a warm smile spreading across his face. Morning, son. Watch those corners now. The boy grinned, pedaling harder. Isaac chuckled softly, shaking his head. Kids these days, always in a hurry, but there was something about their carefree energy that brought him joy. As he climbed into the truck, his fingers brushed against a small notebook resting on the passenger seat. Its edges were worn, the pages filled with precise sketches and handwritten notes. He paused, tracing the cover thoughtfully, then tucked it away before starting the engine. Isaac's route was routine but meaningful. He delivered groceries, packages, and occasionally prescriptions to the residents of the town. Most knew him by name, and those who didn't soon recognized his kind demeanor. At Mrs. Bellamy's house, he carried 2 heavy bags of groceries up her creaking porch steps. Mr. Isaac, you spoil me, she said, leaning on her cane as she opened the door. Just doing what I can, ma'am, Isaac replied, setting the bags down carefully. Well, I appreciate it. You're a godsend. Isaac tipped his cap again, a gesture of humility, and returned to his truck. He always left before they could insist on tipping him. Money wasn't what fueled his work. By mid-afternoon, Isaac had made his way to the other side of town. It was quieter here, the streets lined with aging storefronts and faded signs. He stopped at the small park where kids played on a squeaky swing set and elderly couples sat chatting on weathered benches. Isaac opened the back of his truck and pulled out a box labeled Community Supplies. Inside were soccer balls, coloring books, and other small items he gathered over the months. Mr. Isaac's here, one of the children shouted, and soon a small crowd gathered around him. All right, Isaac said, laughing as he handed out the items. One at a time now. Plenty to go around. Thank you, a little girl said, clutching a new coloring book to her chest. Isaac watched them scatter back to their games, his heart full. This park was a reminder of what he loved most about the town: the connections, the people, the sense of belonging. But not everyone saw Isaac in the same light. At his next stop, a high-end apartment building downtown, the doorman barely glanced at him. "You can leave the deliveries by the service entrance," the man said curtly, waving him off as though he were an inconvenience. Isaac didn't argue. He simply nodded and carried the packages to the back, his step steady. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way, and he doubted it would be the last. Inside the dim-lit service hallway, he passed other workers: janitors, cleaners, delivery drivers, all going about their tasks. They exchanged brief nods, a silent camaraderie born from shared experiences. As Isaac loaded the packages onto a cart, he overheard two executives in suits walking past the open door. "Did you see the latest numbers?" one of them said. "If we don't cut costs, we're done." "We'll start with the bottom." "Always do," the other replied, laughing. Isaac's grip tightened on the cart handle. He didn't know these men, but their words echoed a truth he'd seen too often. Decisions made in boardrooms always hit the little people first. Later that evening, Isaac returned home to his modest one-bedroom apartment. The walls were decorated with photos of his late wife and their two children, now grown and living far away. He set his bag down and pulled out the notebook from the truck. At the small dining table, under the dim light of a single lamp, Isaac flipped through the pages. The sketches inside revealed intricate designs: a community center with a library, a food bank, and classrooms. His dream was to create a space where people could come together, learn, and support one another. But dreams required resources, and resources required money, something Isaac didn't have much of. As he worked on a new sketch, the memory of Sylvia's cutting words from the store earlier that week resurfaced. "We don't need loiterers scaring off paying customers," she'd said. Isaac shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He wasn't bitter, but the sting of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed lingered. The next day, as Isaac made his rounds, he stopped at the local mechanic's shop to drop off a package. "Hey, Isaac," the owner, Joe, greeted him. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Isaac said, setting the package on the counter. Joe hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I hate to ask, but business has been slow, and I'm behind on rent. You wouldn't know anyone looking to buy a place like this, would you?" Isaac's heart sank. Joe's shop had been a staple in the community for decades. "I'll keep an ear out," Isaac promised. As he walked back to his truck, an idea began to form. What if the community center wasn't just a dream? What if it could also save places like Joe's shop? Isaac opened his notebook and jotted down a few notes. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew where to start. In the days that followed, Isaac began talking to people on his route, asking questions, gathering ideas. He spoke with business owners, parents, retirees, anyone who would listen. What if we had a place where kids could study after school? Would you support a space for local businesses to share resources? The responses were overwhelmingly positive, but skepticism lingered. "That's a nice idea, Isaac," one woman said. "But who's going to pay for it?" Isaac didn't have an answer. Not yet. Then Isaac is seen sitting in his truck at the end of another long day. He flips through his notebook, the pages now filled with sketches and notes. The moonlight streams through the windshield, illuminating his determined expression. A small flyer on the seat next to him catches his eye. It's for the town's annual business meeting, a chance for local leaders to pitch ideas and request funding. Isaac picks it up, his fingers tightening around the edges. "This town has overlooked me for too long," he murmurs to himself. "It's time they see what I can do." And with that, he starts his truck, the engine roaring to life. The road ahead won't be easy, but Isaac is ready to face whatever comes next. The store buzzed with its usual activity: shoppers browsing shelves, carts rattling down narrow aisles, and the hum of conversation rising and falling like waves. Isaac stood by the canned goods aisle, his weathered hands resting on the cart handle. His eyes scanned the rows of neatly stacked products, but his mind was elsewhere. A sharp voice cut through the air, pulling him from his thoughts. "Hey, don't touch that unless you're buying it." Isaac turned his head slightly. A young boy stood frozen near a shelf of chips, his hand hovering mid-air. Sylvia's voice rang out again, sharper this time. "You hear me? We're not running a charity here." The boy looked down, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. He muttered a soft "sorry" and shuffled away. Isaac's grip on the cart tightened, the muscles in his jaw flexing. He watched Sylvia, the store manager, as she turned her attention to an employee who was stocking shelves nearby. "Pick up the pace, Darren," she barked. "If you moved any slower, I'd think you were on vacation." Darren mumbled something under his breath, but Sylvia wasn't interested in his response. She adjusted her blazer, her movements sharp and deliberate, and marched toward the registers. Isaac shook his head lightly, pushing his cart down the aisle. At the checkout line, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sylvia was standing near the first register, her arms crossed and her expression set in a permanent scowl. A young cashier fumbled with the scanner, her hands trembling as she tried to ring up an older woman's groceries. "Do I have to do everything myself?" Sylvia snapped, stepping forward and snatching the item from the cashier's hands. She scanned it with one swift motion, slamming it into the bag. "Next time, try not to waste everyone's time," she said, glaring at the cashier, who looked like she might cry. Isaac moved closer, placing his items on the conveyor belt. He could feel the weight of the scene, the quiet unease among the other customers. People avoided eye contact, their heads lowered, as if hoping to disappear. "Excuse me," Isaac said calmly, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. Sylvia turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "What?" "You didn't need to talk to her like that," he said, his tone steady. Sylvia's lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, and who are you to tell me how to run my store?" Isaac met her gaze, unflinching. "Just someone who believes in treating people with respect." A few customers glanced up, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. Sylvia, however, looked unfazed. She stepped closer to Isaac, her heels kicking sharply against the tile floor. "Listen," she said, her voice low and icy. "I don't know who you think you are, but I don't have time for lectures from nobody. Now, if you're done playing hero, you can pay for your groceries and move along." Isaac tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You should be careful how you speak to people," he said softly. Sylvia let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, please. People like you come and go. You're all the same, quiet, unimportant, forgettable." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Isaac's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of something unspoken. By now, the scene had drawn more attention. Customers lingered near the registers, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Darren, the employee from earlier, stood frozen in the background, his eyes darting nervously between Isaac and Sylvia. "I think you owe her an apology," Isaac said, nodding toward the cashier. Sylvia raised an eyebrow, her face twisting into a mockery of surprise. "An apology? To her?" She scoffed, shaking her head. "You must be joking." "I'm not," Isaac replied evenly. Sylvia took a step closer, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Let me make something clear. This is my store, my rules. If you don't like how I run things, you're welcome to leave." Isaac didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his silence louder than any words. Sylvia rolled her eyes and turned back to the cashier. "Finish ringing him up," she snapped. "I don't have all day." The cashier hesitated, her hands shaking as she scanned Isaac's items. "Take your time," Isaac said gently, offering her a reassuring smile. The cashier nodded, her movements steadying slightly. Sylvia, meanwhile, stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. As Isaac paid for his groceries and turned to leave, Sylvia called out after him. "Next time, keep your opinions to yourself," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're just another customer. Nothing more, nothing less." Isaac paused, his back still turned to her. For a moment, the store seemed to hold its breath. Then he turned slowly, his eyes meeting Sylvia's. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the people you think are nothing turn out to be something." Sylvia opened her mouth to respond, but Isaac had already turned away, pushing his cart toward the exit. The murmurs started almost immediately. Customers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of awe and unease. Darren watched Isaac leave, a flicker of hope crossing his face. But Sylvia stood rigid, her jaw tight, and her cheeks flushed. She didn't like being challenged, especially not in her own store. As Isaac disappeared through the sliding doors, Sylvia muttered under her breath, "Who does he think he is?" She had no idea. Sylvia stormed back to her office, her frustration bubbling over, while Isaac strolled to his truck with an air of calm. His expression remained unreadable, but his posture exuded quiet strength, leaving an unspoken question lingering. Who is this man, and what fuels his unwavering confidence? The rain came down in steady sheets, tapping against the glass windows of Isaac's modest apartment. He sat at his dining table, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating the room. Spread before him were old photographs, faded legal documents, and a thick, leather-bound journal. Each item told a story, a life lived, a dream built, and then shattered. Isaac flipped open the journal, his fingers brushing against the ink-stained pages. It was all there, the plans, the hopes, the calculations. His hand trembled slightly as he turned to a page dated 15 years ago. Grand opening, it read, in bold, hopeful letters. Beneath it was a photo of a younger Isaac standing in front of the store. His smile was bright, his suit crisp, and beside him was a sign that read, "Welcome to Haven Market, where community comes first." He stared at the picture, his jaw tightening. How had it all gone so wrong? The memory came rushing back, vivid and raw. The store had been his pride and joy. Haven Market wasn't just a business to Isaac. It was a place where neighbors gathered, where struggling families found support, and where everyone, no matter their background, felt they belonged. Isaac had poured everything into it, his savings, his time, and his heart. The first few years had been tough, but the community had rallied around him. Sales grew, and the market became a cornerstone of the neighborhood. And then Sylvia came into his life. She had been charming at first, her sharp business acumen and ambitious ideas catching Isaac's attention. She was just an employee then, working her way up the ranks with apparent dedication. Isaac had seen her potential and given her opportunities, trusting her with responsibilities others might have withheld. But Sylvia had her own agenda. Isaac didn't see it at first, blinded by his belief in giving people chances. Sylvia had started taking over small aspects of the business, handling suppliers, managing payroll, and eventually negotiating contracts. She was good at what she did, no doubt, but she was also cunning. The betrayal had been slow, like a tide rising unnoticed, until it was too late. Isaac had trusted her completely. When she suggested he bring in new investors to expand the store, he agreed. The paperwork was dense, the legal jargon unfamiliar, but Sylvia assured him it was all above board. "Don't worry, Isaac," she'd said, flashing her signature smile. "I've got everything under control." He'd signed the documents without question, believing she had his best interests at heart. What he didn't know was that Sylvia had been working behind the scenes, cutting deals with the investors. The fine print of those contracts handed over controlling shares of Haven Market to the board she'd assembled. a board that answered to her. By the time Isaac realized what had happened, it was too late. Isaac slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breathing. The betrayal had cost him everything. He'd lost the store, his savings, and a part of himself. Sylvia had taken over, rebranding the market into the cold, impersonal chain it was now. And yet she acted as if she built it all herself. Isaac's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Coming," he called, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. When he opened the door, Darren stood there, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Mr. Isaac," Darren said, his voice hesitant. "Can I talk to you?" Isaac nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Darren looked around nervously, his eyes landing on the cluttered table. "Sorry if I'm bothering you," Darren said, shifting on his feet. "You're not," Isaac replied, motioning for him to sit. Darren hesitated before speaking. "It's about the store, Sylvia. She's been making it harder for everyone. Cutting hours, yelling at us for no reason. I don't know what to do." Isaac studied the young man for a moment. Darren's frustration was palpable, but so was his fear. "She's been like this for years," Isaac said finally. "People like Sylvia thrive on control. They think power is what makes them untouchable." "But it's not right," Darren said, his voice rising slightly. "She treats everyone like they're beneath her. Someone has to do something." Isaac's lips pressed into a thin line. Darren's words echoed the thoughts he'd been wrestling with for days. The next morning, Isaac returned to the store, his usual calm demeanor masking the storm within. As he walked through the aisles, he noticed the subtle changes Sylvia had made over the years. Less emphasis on community products, more on high-margin goods. The friendly faces that once staffed the store had been replaced by overworked employees who avoided eye contact. "Morning, Mr. Isaac," one of the cashiers said softly as he passed. Her voice was polite, but there was a weariness in her tone. Isaac nodded in reply, his mind racing. He stopped near the produce section, watching as an elderly man struggled to reach a bag of apples on the top shelf. "Here, let me help you," Isaac said, grabbing the bag and handing it to the man. "Thank you," the man said, smiling gratefully. Not many people would bother these days. Isaac's chest tightened. That wasn't how it used to be. In the following weeks, Isaac began taking quiet steps toward reclaiming what he'd lost. He started gathering information, old contacts, forgotten documents, anything that might give him an edge. He spoke with former employees, community members, and even a few of the current staff who were willing to trust him. Piece by piece, the puzzle started to come together. He learned that some of the investors who had backed Sylvia's takeover were unhappy with how things had turned out. Sales were declining, and her abrasive leadership style was driving away loyal employees. Isaac saw an opportunity. One evening, as Isaac sat at his table, reviewing a stack of papers, he noticed something he'd overlooked before. A clause in the original contract that stated the majority shareholder could call for a vote to replace the CEO. His heart raced as he read the clause again, the implications sinking in. He didn't own the store anymore, but he still held a significant number of shares, enough to make his voice heard. Isaac leaned back in his chair, a determined glint in his eyes. The rain had ceased, leaving the world outside calm and still. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. "Not yet." The picture was becoming clearer, the pieces aligning. Isaac knew it was time to act. The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter, the kind that barely masked the tension in the air. Isaac sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight and hands resting calmly on the polished wood. His lawyer, a young woman named Rachel with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, shuffled through a stack of papers. Isaac's face was stoic, but his heart pounded. This moment had been months in the making, a long road paved with late nights, endless paperwork, and difficult conversations. He had rallied the community, gathered evidence, and filed his case against Sylvia and her corporate allies. Today was the hearing that would decide whether the case would move forward. All rise, the bailiff called, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The judge entered, a stern woman with an air of authority that silenced the room instantly. Isaac stood, his gaze steady, even as he caught a glimpse of Sylvia out of the corner of his eye. She sat at the defendant's table, her perfectly tailored suit and confident smirk radiating arrogance. She leaned over to whisper something to her lawyer, her laugh soft but mocking. Isaac didn't flinch. The hearing began with Rachel presenting the evidence, a timeline of Sylvia's actions, contracts that revealed her manipulations, and testimonies from former employees and community members. "Your Honor," Rachel began, her voice strong and clear. "This case isn't just about a man who lost his business. It's about deceit, exploitation, and the betrayal of trust." The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable. Isaac watched as Rachel laid out the facts, each piece of evidence tightening the noose around Sylvia's defense. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. But Sylvia was not one to go down without a fight. When her lawyer stood, his tone was smooth and calculated, like oil on water. "Your Honor," he said, smiling faintly. "While Mr. Isaac's story is certainly compelling, it's also incomplete. My client has followed every legal procedure and has acted in the best interests of the company and its shareholders." He handed a document to the judge. "This is a record of the profits generated under Ms. Sylvia's leadership. Profits that have benefited not just the company, but the community as a whole." Isaac clenched his fists under the table. He knew the numbers were manipulated, but proving it in court was another matter entirely. Sylvia's lawyer continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Isaac's claims, while emotional, lacked the substantive evidence required to move this case forward." The judge called for a recess. Isaac stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, his thoughts racing. "You're doing great," Rachel said, joining him. "Don't let them get in your head. We've got the truth on our side." Isaac nodded, but his mind was restless. He glanced across the courtyard and saw Sylvia standing with a group of people, corporate executives, no doubt. She was laughing, her confidence unshaken. For a brief moment, Isaac's resolve wavered. The next day, news of the case spread through the community. Some people rallied around Isaac, offering their support and sharing their own stories of Sylvia's ruthless behavior. Others, swayed by the narrative crafted by Sylvia and her team, began to doubt him. "She's just doing her job," one man said at the local diner. "Business is business." "Isaac's a good man, but maybe he's in over his head," another added. Isaac heard these whispers as he made his rounds. They stung, but they also fueled his determination. One evening, Isaac received a call from Rachel. "There's been a development," she said, her voice tense. "What kind of development?" Isaac asked. "Sylvia's team is spreading rumors," Rachel explained. "They're claiming you mismanaged funds back when you owned the store. It's baseless, but they've got enough people talking to make it look credible." Isaac's grip tightened on the phone. "Of course they are," he muttered. "They're trying to discredit you," Rachel continued. "It's dirty, but it's effective. We need to be prepared for this to get uglier." Isaac took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We'll handle it," he said firmly. The next day, Isaac walked into the store, his stall, with a renewed sense of purpose. The employees glanced at him as he entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. Sylvia appeared moments later, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached him. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "If it isn't the man of the hour." Isaac met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm not here for you, Sylvia," he said calmly. "I'm here for them." He gestured to the employees and customers around them. Sylvia laughed, shaking her head. "Always the hero, aren't you? Tell me, Isaac, How does it feel to chase a battle you can't win? Isaac smiled faintly. We'll see about that. The community began to rally in unexpected ways. People who had once been silent started speaking up, sharing their experiences and offering support. A former employee posted on social media about the toxic environment Sylvia had created. Another wrote a letter to the local newspaper, praising Isaac's integrity and commitment to the community. The tide was starting to turn, but Sylvia wasn't done yet. Late one night, Isaac received an envelope slid under his apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a forged document that seemed to implicate him in financial wrongdoing. It was a warning, a threat. Isaac stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. He knew exactly where it had come from. This is how they want to play it, he muttered to himself. Then let's play. Isaac sat at the table, the forged document in one hand and his journal in the other. His expression remained calm, but his eyes betrayed a fierce determination as his mind churned with plans. The fight was far from over, and Isaac was prepared for whatever lay ahead. Isaac sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The rain tapped softly against the window, a gentle rhythm that contrasted the storm brewing in his chest. He stared at the pile of legal papers in front of him, his eyes tracing the fine print. His fingers, calloused from years of hard work, ran over the edges of the documents, his mind trying to make sense of what had just clicked into place. There it was. A single clause, buried deep in the original contract, had eluded him for years. His legal team had missed it. Sylvia had brushed it aside, but now it was right in front of him, as clear as day. He'd been wronged. The clause gave him a way to challenge Sylvia's control over the company. He still had a chance. Isaac leaned back in his chair, the revelation sinking in. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Sylvia had manipulated the system, yes, but he hadn't been the fool she thought him to be. The next morning, Isaac walked into his office, a determined set to his jaw. The office had once been his kingdom, his pride and joy. Now, it felt like a cold, empty shell. He wasn't alone for long. Darren, the young man who'd once worked for him, appeared at the door, his face a mix of hesitation and urgency. "I've got something for you," Darren said, handing Isaac a small envelope. Isaac took it without a word, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Inside was a letter from a former business partner, someone Sylvia had betrayed long before Isaac lost control of the company. The letter was brief, but its contents were explosive. "I know what Sylvia did to you," it read. "I'm willing to help. You're not alone in this." Isaac looked up at Darren, his eyes narrowing. "What's this about?" Isaac asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. Darren shifted uneasily. "I found out. Sylvia had been covering up some stuff. Big stuff. She's been playing everyone, but you've got allies, Isaac. People who've seen what she's really doing. They're willing to back you up if you fight." Isaac's heart beat faster. "Who?" "I don't know all the names yet," Darren said. "But there's a network. People who've been burned by her. People who are just waiting for someone to step up." Isaac's mind raced, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to fight this battle alone. As the days passed, Isaac began gathering his allies. Some were former employees, others were local business owners who had once worked alongside Sylvia. Isaac had built relationships over the years, some that had been neglected, some that had been severed by Sylvia's manipulations. But now, those bonds were coming back to him. One of the first to reach out was Carla, a woman who had worked as the head cashier before Sylvia had pushed her out. Carla had always been a quiet presence in the store, but Isaac had seen the strength in her, a strength that Sylvia had tried to crush. "I don't have much," Carla said when she called Isaac, her voice shaking. "But I know enough to help. Sylvia can't be allowed to keep doing this." Isaac's chest swelled with pride. He knew that no matter how powerful Sylvia had become, There was one thing she could never take away from him: the loyalty of the people he had once worked with. Isaac and Carla met in the back room of the store, the air thick with anticipation. "Here's what we know," Carla said, sliding a stack of papers across the table. "Sylvia's been falsifying sales reports to make it seem like the store's losing money. She's been pocketing the difference." Isaac felt the blood rush to his face. "How long has this been going on?" "Longer than we realized," Carla replied. "But I've got a copy of the original financial records. The real ones. And I've got the documents that prove she's been manipulating the books." Isaac stared at the papers, his mind racing. This is it. This is how we bring her down. But even as he spoke, doubts began to creep in. Sylvia was powerful. She had connections, resources, and a cold, calculated mind. Was it enough? The next evening, Isaac met with Rachel, his lawyer, to go over the evidence. She pored over the documents, her brow furrowing as she examined the details. "This is solid," she said, looking up at Isaac. "But we need more. This could be enough to get Sylvia's scheme exposed, but we'll need to make sure we have a witness, someone who can testify against her." Isaac nodded, his mind already turning. "I know just the person." The following morning, Sylvia's cold smile greeted Isaac as he entered the store. She wasn't expecting him to be back. "Back for more, Isaac," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. Isaac stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "No, Sylvia, I'm back to take what's mine." She laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "You really think you can take this from me? You've got nothing." Isaac's voice dropped, the weight of his words landing heavily in the space between them. "I've got the truth, and that's more than you'll ever have." Isaac sat at the table, the forged document in one hand and his journal in the other. His expression remained calm, but his eyes betrayed a fierce determination as his mind churned with plans. The fight was far from over, and Isaac was prepared for whatever lay ahead. Isaac could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the courtroom waited for the next words to be spoken. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment it felt as though time had slowed down. He looked around at the sea of eyes watching him, some sympathetic, others skeptical. But all of them were waiting for something, some moment of truth that would bring everything into focus. The judge's voice broke through the silence. "All rise," she commanded. Isaac stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment in his bones. The room felt different now. It was no longer just a court hearing. It was the culmination of years of pain, betrayal, and redemption. His life, once defined by hard work and humility, now stood at the edge of a precipice. Everything he had fought for, everything he had lost, was hanging in the balance. He glanced at Sylvia, the woman who had once been a trusted ally, now the face of his downfall. She sat across from him at the defendant's table, her back straight, a smug smile playing on her lips. Her polished appearance, immaculate suit, carefully styled hair, gave her the air of someone who believed they had already won. She had always been good at this, at projecting an image of invincibility. But today, Isaac saw the cracks. The proceedings continued with Rachel, Isaac's attorney, laying out the case with relentless precision. She spoke of the deceit, the manipulations, the lies Sylvia had told to not only take the business, but to destroy the trust Isaac had spent decades building. Rachel's voice was calm, but her words were sharp, cutting through the layers of pretension Sylvia had built around herself. "Your Honor," Rachel began, her eyes locked on the judge, "we are not here to waste anyone's time with baseless claims. This is not a case of a disgruntled ex-business owner. This is a case of betrayal at the highest level. Sylvia Jackson used a legal loophole to wrestle control from Mr. Isaac, exploiting his trust and his kindness for her own gain." Isaac held his breath, every muscle in his body tight with anticipation. The room was silent as Rachel laid out the facts, piece by piece, documents, testimonies, hard evidence. And then, with the dramatic pause of a seasoned litigator, Rachel revealed the smoking gun. The clause, she said. The clause that allowed Ms. Jackson to seize control of Haven Market. The clause that Mr. Isaac missed due to trust, due to believing in the people he surrounded himself with. That clause is the heart of this matter. Isaac felt a surge of pride. The truth was finally coming to light. Sylvia's lawyer immediately rose to his feet. His voice was calm, but Isaac could hear the undercurrent of panic beneath the practiced tone. Your Honor, the lawyer said, this clause, while clearly a mistake, was agreed upon by both parties. This isn't some nefarious act. It's a part of business. A part of the system that's allowed Mr. Isaac to make profits, take risks, and grow his company. And now, after losing control, he wants to come back and rewrite the rules. Isaac's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. The argument was predictable. Same old deflections, same old tricks. Rachel wasn't fazed. The law does not permit the exploitation of another person's trust for personal gain. This is a case of fraud, not business decisions. It is a case of stealing from a man who worked hard to build something worthwhile, something that benefited his community. And now Ms. Jackson has used that trust to turn it into a shell of what it once was. Sylvia's face remained impassive, but Isaac saw it now, the smallest crack in her armor. Her fingers, which had once rested casually on the table, were now tightly clasped. The calm facade was slipping. Your Honor, Sylvia's lawyer continued, what Mr. Isaac fails to understand is that businesses evolve. Things change. Clauses get overlooked. This was a mistake on both sides, but it is not a criminal act. Rachel's voice was low but powerful. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional, planned, and orchestrated, and I'm here to prove it. The courtroom went silent. Isaac felt the weight of it, the pressure building. He knew it wasn't over yet, but something had changed. For the first time, Sylvia didn't look so confident. The smugness had faded, replaced by a flicker of doubt. She shot a glance at her lawyer, but it wasn't the same dismissive look she had given him earlier. This was different. Something had cracked. Isaac stood, feeling the weight of the moment more than ever. His mind flashed back to the day he had signed those papers. The day he had unknowingly handed over the keys to everything he had worked for. Sylvia had been so persuasive, so convincing. He'd had trusted her. And now, standing before the court, he could see the full extent of her manipulation. I trusted her, Isaac whispered, barely audible to anyone but himself. The words carried years of pain, years of lost trust. The judge leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Ms. Jackson, can you explain why the documents in question contain such discrepancies? Why was this clause hidden from Mr. Isaac? Sylvia's eyes flashed with anger. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For a brief moment, the courtroom held its collective breath. Isaac could see the moment she realized there was no way out. The trap had been set, and now it was closing in around her. She looked at Isaac, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. And then it happened. Rachel, like a seasoned chess player making her final move, dropped the last piece of the puzzle into place. The clause that allowed Sylvia Jackson to seize control wasn't just an oversight, Rachel declared. It was crafted specifically to give her the ability to push Mr. Isaac out. She has been working behind the scenes to orchestrate a corporate takeover, a hostile one. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it for her own gain, at the expense of everyone else. Isaac felt the shockwave in the room. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The truth was out. Sylvia stood up abruptly, her face pale, her body trembling. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, she looked vulnerable. Isaac stepped forward, his voice strong but steady, his words cutting through the silence. You knew. You knew exactly what you were doing when you betrayed me, Sylvia. And now, the truth is out. No more lies, no more manipulation. It's time for you to face what you've done. The room fell silent again, But this time, the silence was different. It was filled with a sense of resolution, a sense of justice that had been long overdue. As Sylvia's lawyer tried to regain control of the situation, Isaac stood firm, his hands at his sides. He had nothing left to prove. The truth was clear for everyone to see. Sylvia's empire, built on lies and deceit, was crumbling. Isaac turned toward the judge, his face filled with quiet determination. "It's over," he said simply. "The truth will be heard, and justice will be served." The judge's gaze fixed on Sylvia, her expression hardening as the gravity of the situation settled in. Isaac stood firm, his resolve unshaken. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The truth was finally out, and Sylvia's dominion was teetering on the brink. Yet, the decisive blow had yet to land. Would Sylvia retaliate, or had her actions finally led her to an inescapable reckoning? Isaac stepped into the heart of the store, his feet steady on the familiar floor, but his heart thundering in his chest. The air was thick with tension, and the ringing of the cash registers seemed louder than ever. This wasn't just another visit. This was the moment that everything would change. Sylvia had no idea what was coming. He had waited for this moment for months. Every move, every conversation, every legal document had been a carefully calculated piece of the puzzle. And now, he stood at the center of it all. The store that had once been his, the store that Sylvia had stolen from him, was his again. And this time, Isaac wasn't just here to reclaim what was rightfully his. He was here to turn it into something bigger, something better. Sylvia was already at the front of the store, overseeing the chaos that was her domain. Her eyes caught Isaac's as he walked in, and for a moment, a confident smile faltered. But she quickly recovered, standing up straighter, her heels kicking sharply against the polished floor. "Back again, Isaac?" she called out, her voice dripping with mockery. She made no effort to hide the disdain in her eyes. "I thought we were done with you. You've got no place here anymore." Isaac didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked with hers, unwavering, as he slowly approached the counter. "You're wrong, Sylvia," Isaac said, his voice low but steady. "I never left. I've been watching, waiting for the right moment. And now it's here." Sylvia's smile faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. She stepped forward, her hands on her hips. "What do you think you're going to do, huh? You think you can just waltz in here and take it all back?" Isaac's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of the customers, of the employees on him. They all knew. They all saw what she had done, but they hadn't known what Isaac had been planning. "I've already taken it back," Isaac said, his words sharp and final. "It's done." Sylvia's eyes narrowed, a flicker of panic flashing across her face. "What are you talking about?" Isaac stepped forward, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. The room seemed to quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly louder. He unfolded the paper, letting it hang in the air between them. "This is the original transfer of ownership agreement," Isaac said, his voice booming across the store now. And this he tapped the paper, emphasizing each word. "It's the clause you thought you could use to steal from me." Sylvia's face went white. She took a step back, but Isaac wasn't done. "This clause was never meant to be exploited. It was a mistake. My mistake. But I corrected it." Her face twisted, trying to mask the shock with an attempt at arrogance. "You don't have the power to change that. I'm in control here, Isaac." Isaac shook his head. "You were in control, Sylvia, but not anymore." Rachel, Isaac's lawyer, stepped forward from the crowd of employees who had gathered. She had been waiting in the wings, watching as the situation unfolded. "Your Honor, we've come to this store to expose Sylvia Jackson's illegal activities. We've gathered testimonies from former employees, customers, and even former business partners who have been victimized by her manipulations," Rachel said, turning toward the judge who was presiding over the case. Sylvia's eyes flicked nervously toward Rachel, but she remained silent, knowing there was no way out of this. Isaac turned to the employees standing behind him. "This is your store now," he said, his voice full of emotion. "It's always been yours. You've been the heart of this place, not Sylvia. Not the people in corporate. This is about us, about taking back what we've all worked for." The employees exchanged glances, and for the first time in a long while, Isaac saw the spark of hope in their eyes. They had been under Sylvia's thumb for too long, afraid to speak out, afraid of losing their jobs. But now, they saw Isaac's resolve, and something in them shifted. Sylvia's mouth twisted with rage as she tried to regain control. "You can't do this, Isaac. You'll ruin everything. You'll destroy what we've built." She was desperate now, her voice rising. "Do you really think the community will back you after all this?" Isaac met her gaze, unflinching. "The community is backing me, Sylvia. This store is a reflection of what we've built together, and together, we're stronger than anything you can throw at us." The crowd around them, the customers who had been waiting in line, the employees who had been watching silently, began to murmur in agreement. The tide was turning. Sylvia had no control over them anymore. Sylvia's lawyer made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "This isn't over," he said, stepping forward with a piece of paper. "We'll take this to the board. We'll get new investors. You won't win." Isaac's eyes flashed with fury. He stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "I don't need investors, Sylvia. I don't need anyone but the people who've always believed in me." Isaac turned to the crowd of employees again. "This is your chance. You've worked hard enough. You've earned it. This store, this community, is yours." The silence that followed was heavy. Sylvia's face twisted with frustration, but she couldn't speak. Her empire had crumbled, and she knew it. The lies she had built her life on were unraveling before her eyes. Isaac took a deep breath. "The store is open for everyone," he said, his voice booming across the room. "But it's ours now, and it always should have been." Suddenly, the room was filled with applause. The employees, the customers, they were cheering. Sylvia stood frozen in place, her face red with anger and humiliation. The crowd had turned on her, their support now squarely behind Isaac. Isaac looked at Sylvia one last time. "You've lost. But the community? We're just getting started." He turned away, walking toward the back of the store, where the employees were already gathered, talking among themselves, preparing for the changes Isaac had promised. Isaac turned his back on Sylvia, but this victory wasn't his alone. It belonged to everyone. The community had found its strength, standing united against the corporate greed that had tried to crush them. He didn't need the office, the investors, or the title. What he had now was far greater: the trust and respect of the people who had always believed in him. Behind him, Sylvia stood frozen, her defeat marked by the thunderous applause that filled the store. Her grip on power was broken, and Isaac had reclaimed what she had sought to take. Yet, uncertainty lingered. As Sylvia's lawyer began preparing for one last desperate counterattack, Isaac knew the fight was far from over. The true battle, for the community's future, would be waged right here, on the very ground Sylvia had tried to claim as her own. The dust had barely settled from the courtroom battle, but Isaac stood taller than ever. The courthouse doors closed behind him with a heavy thud, but he didn't feel the weight. His victory had been hard fought, but it wasn't the type of win that tasted sweet. It tasted like something else, like a long-awaited breath after years of holding it in. It wasn't about the store, the money, or the power. It was about restoring the dignity that had been stripped away, and that, Isaac realized, was the most powerful thing of all. Outside, the air was crisp. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the steps where Isaac stood. He took a moment to soak it all in. It wasn't just the end of a legal battle. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something the community had been yearning for. Behind him, Sylvia's final attempt to regain control had crumbled. The investors had pulled back, the board had turned against her, and her reputation had been irrevocably damaged. Sylvia stood on the other side of the courtroom, surrounded by her loyal lawyers. But Isaac didn't need to turn around to see her. He didn't need to hear her voice again. For him, the battle was over. The first few weeks after the trial were a whirlwind. Isaac worked with his old employees to bring the store back to life. They renamed it Haven Market again, its original name a symbol of their resilience. The shelves were stocked with fresh produce from local farmers, the aisles were clean and well lit, and there was a palpable sense of warmth and pride that hadn't been there in years. Isaac wasn't just rebuilding a business, he was rebuilding a community. Sylvia had tried to fight back, but every attempt failed. Her whispers in the press, her desperate phone calls to old contacts, didn't have the same power anymore. Isaac had already stripped away her lies, and the truth was like a shield that protected him. Still, Sylvia wasn't finished yet. One morning, Isaac stood in the store, watching the customers flow in. The bell above the door jingled with each new person who entered, and with each one, Isaac felt a quiet sense of pride. This was what it was all about, the people who supported the store, the ones who had kept it going even when Sylvia had taken over. They weren't just customers anymore, they were family. But then, just as Isaac thought things were settling down, Sylvia appeared at the entrance, her heels clicking against the floor. She stood there for a moment, as though taking in everything she had once controlled. Isaac didn't flinch, but the rest of the store seemed to pause, sensing the tension. "I should have known you'd turn it around," Sylvia said, her voice cool, but with an undercurrent of bitterness. She wasn't here for reconciliation. She was here for one final confrontation. Isaac met her gaze without hesitation. His heart didn't race. He had already won that battle. "You've lost, Sylvia," he said calmly, his voice carrying through the store. "But this isn't about winning or losing anymore. It's about what comes next. And I'm not interested in dragging you through the mud. You've already done that to yourself." Sylvia's face twisted with anger. "You think you're the hero here, don't you?" Her voice rose. "You think you've changed something. You're just a pawn in a bigger game. And you'll always be beneath people like me." Isaac took a slow breath, his mind clear. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice steady. "It's not about being above anyone. It's about standing beside people. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard." He turned toward the rest of the store, where the employees had stopped working to watch. They were listening. Sylvia had been right about one thing. Isaac wasn't like the people she was used to. He wasn't there to prove he was superior. He was there to prove that the community mattered more than anything else. "Take it easy, Sylvia," Isaac added, turning back to face her. "I'm not going to fight you anymore. You've already lost. Now it's time to let this place be what it was always meant to be." Sylvia didn't respond immediately. For a moment, there was only the sound of the store's background hum. Then slowly, Sylvia turned on her heel and walked out, her heels tapping softly as she retreated. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It was quiet. Her defeat was undeniable. Isaac watched her go, but he didn't feel satisfaction. He felt a quiet relief. The battle was over, and Sylvia had finally been left behind. A week later, Isaac was at a town hall meeting, speaking to a room full of people, business owners, local leaders, and community members. His voice rang out with clarity and purpose, but it wasn't just his voice that was heard. It was the collective voice of the people he had fought for. "You see," Isaac began, looking around the room, "this store, Haven Market, isn't just a business. It's a symbol. A symbol of what happens when we stand together. When we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. And it's time we start running our businesses with that in mind, not just for profit, but for the people who make it all possible." There was a pause as the room absorbed his words. Then slowly, one by one, people began to nod. Isaac smiled. This wasn't just about this store. It was about changing how businesses were run, how people were treated, and how everyone had a part to play in creating something better. He wasn't just reclaiming what was his. He was helping build something new. In the weeks that followed, word spread. Local businesses began to model themselves after Isaac's new approach. They made choices that were driven by people, not by power or profit. Sylvia's reign was over, and in its place was a new era for the community. The changes were small at first, but they were real. And Isaac knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Months later, Isaac stood outside the store, watching as a group of kids played basketball in the newly paved court next to the market. The community center he had dreamed about was finally being built, its walls rising up around the old park. He smiled to himself, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. It was a feeling of peace, of hope. Behind him, the door to Haven Market opened, and a familiar voice called out, "You still up for that game?" Isaac turned and saw Darren, one of the young men who had stood by him through it all, walking toward him with a basketball in hand. Isaac chuckled and took the ball from Darren's hands. "For old time's sake," Isaac said with a grin. Together, they joined the kids on the court. Isaac wasn't just the owner of the store anymore. He wasn't just the man who had fought against Sylvia. He was part of something bigger, part of a community that had finally found its way back. As he took a shot and watched the ball soar through the air, Isaac knew that this was the true victory. Not the store, not the money, but the people, and the change they had made together. The story ends with Isaac, ball in hand, standing at the center of the community he had helped rebuild. Sylvia's defeat had been inevitable, but Isaac's rise was something different, something more lasting. The change was already here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Isaac had won, not through power, but through the very thing that had always been his heart. The camera pulls away, and the final shot lingers on Isaac's face, a satisfied smile playing at the edges of his lips, as he looks out over the community that was now stronger than ever. The story reaches its emotional crescendo as Isaac's triumph becomes more than just reclaiming the store. It's a victory for the entire community. His actions have sparked a sense of empowerment, paving the way for lasting change and unity. Sylvia's downfall, though gratifying, takes a back seat to the moral strength of Isaac's journey. In his resilience and dedication, he's inspired hope, proving that true power lies not in control, but in the bonds forged through shared purpose and determination.